On a brutal winter night in the Wyoming Territory, a 68-year-old widow saw a desperate cowboy and his freezing wife clutching their newborn baby. Every instinct told her to be cautious, but when she heard the infant's weakening cries, she threw open her door and whispered, "Come inside. You're safe now." A week later, dozens of horses thundered onto her property, and what the riders brought with them left her speechless. Before we begin this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The blizzard had come down from the mountains like a vengeful spirit, burying Red Creek under layers of snow so thick that the town seemed to disappear entirely. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling shutters and snapping fence posts in half. Most folks had barricaded themselves inside, praying the storm would pass quickly. But out on Copper Ridge, Eleanor Thornton faced the cold alone, just as she had for the past 5 winters. At 68, Ellie moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned that life was not a race, but a long, winding path full of unexpected turns. Her silver hair, always tied back in a simple braid, framed a face that had seen more sorrow than most. The ranch house, though modest, had once been filled with laughter, William's deep voice calling her name from the barn, the clatter of boots on the porch, the warmth of a family gathered around the dinner table. Now, the silence pressed in from all sides. She stood by the stone fireplace, feeding another log into the flames. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind shrieked like a wounded animal, and the snow piled higher against the windows. Ellie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and glanced toward the mantel, where a small tin-framed photograph rested. William stared back at her, his arm wrapped around her waist, both of them young and smiling on their wedding day. Beside the photograph sat a tiny wooden horse he had carved by hand, a gift meant for the grandson they had lost to fever after only 4 days of life. Ellie's fingers brushed the smooth wood, and she closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her before pushing it away. The ranch had been her sanctuary after William's death, a place where she could grieve in peace, but it had also become a prison of sorts. Her son, Clayton, had stopped visiting years ago, showing up only when he needed money or when Vera, his sharp-tongued wife, decided it was time to remind Ellie of how little she had left to give. Their last visit had ended in shouting, with Clayton demanding she sell the ranch and move into town. "You're wasting away out here, Ma," he had said, his voice cold and distant. "This place is worth something. You could live comfortably if you just let it go." But Ellie had refused. The ranch was all she had left of William, of the life they had built together. She would rather freeze in the winter and sweat through the summer than surrender the only home that still felt like hers. Tonight, as the storm raged outside, Ellie prepared a simple supper: bread, cheese, and a bowl of stew she had made earlier in the week. She ate slowly by the fire, listening to the wind battering the walls. The loneliness was heaviest at night, when the house felt too big and the memories too small to fill it. She thought about the town, about the neighbors who had stopped checking on her after William died. They were polite enough when she ventured into Red Creek for supplies, but there was a distance now, a quiet judgment that came from living alone as a woman past her prime. People whispered that she was stubborn, that she should have moved in with Clayton, that she was clinging to the past. Maybe they were right, maybe she was. But as Ellie stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and twist, she couldn't bring herself to care. This was her life, her choice. She had raised a son, buried a husband, and lost a grandchild. If the world thought her foolish for wanting to live out her days in the home she had built with her own hands, then so be it. The fire crackled louder, and a sudden gust of wind rattled the door. Ellie glanced toward the window, where the snow pressed thick against the glass. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and then, cutting through the wind like a blade, came the sound of pounding, desperate, frantic, insistent. Someone was at her door. Ellie's heart jumped at the sound. The pounding came again, harder this time, followed by a voice, deep, strained, barely audible over the howling wind. "Please, is anyone there? Please, we need help." She froze, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Out here, miles from town, visitors were rare even in good weather. In a blizzard like this, they were unheard of. Her mind raced through possibilities: bandits, drifters, men looking for easy prey. A woman alone was vulnerable, and everyone in Red Creek knew the Thornton Ranch sat isolated on the ridge. The pounding continued, more frantic now, and then came another sound that cut straight through Ellie's hesitation: the thin, desperate wail of a baby. The cry was weak, almost smothered by the storm, but unmistakable. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She moved toward the door, her hand trembling as it hovered over the bolt. Every cautious bone in her body screamed at her to stay inside, to wait until morning, to protect herself first. But that cry, so faint, so fragile, pulled at something deep within her, something she thought had died with her grandson 5 years ago. She slid the bolt open and pulled the door wide. The wind slammed into her like a physical force, nearly knocking her back. Snow swirled into the house, and through the white chaos she saw them. A man, towering and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a bandana pulled up against the cold. His long coat was caked with ice, and his gloved hands clutched a bundle wrapped in blankets. Behind him stood a young woman, barely more than a girl, her thin frame shaking violently, her lips blue, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, ma'am," the man said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Our baby, she can't take much more of this. We've been riding for hours. The storm came out of nowhere. Please, we just need somewhere warm." Ellie's eyes dropped to the bundle in his arms. A tiny face peeked out from the blankets, the baby's skin pale and mottled, her cries growing weaker with each passing second. The young woman behind him stumbled forward, barely able to stand. "We knocked on 3 houses in town," the woman said, her voice trembling. "One man saw Caleb's coat and gun and slammed the door in our faces. Another told us to keep moving. Please, I'm begging you. My daughter is dying." Ellie's gaze shifted back to the man. His coat was weathered and patched, his boots worn thin. He looked like a drifter, a hired gun, maybe worse. The kind of man respectable folk crossed the street to avoid, but his eyes, dark and exhausted, held no malice, only raw, unfiltered fear. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. She thought of Clayton's warnings, of the stories she'd heard about strangers on the frontier, of all the reasons she should turn them away. And then the baby's cry cut through the wind again, weaker this time, barely a whisper. Ellie stepped back and pulled the door open wider. "Get inside," she said, her voice firm and steady. "All of you. Right now." The man didn't hesitate. He crossed the threshold first, snow falling from his coat in clumps, and immediately began unwrapping the blankets from the baby. The young woman stumbled in after him, collapsing against the wall as Ellie shut the door and bolted it tight. The warmth of the fire hit them all at once, and the baby's cries grew slightly louder, as if the heat was coaxing life back into her tiny body. Ellie moved quickly, her instincts taking over. She grabbed a clean blanket from the chest by the wall and spread it near the fire. "Bring her here," she said, gesturing to the man. "Lay her down close to the warmth, but not too close." The man, Caleb, the woman had called him, knelt by the fire and carefully laid the baby on the blanket. Ellie leaned over her, her experienced hands checking the child's breathing, her color, the coldness of her skin. "She's breathing," Ellie murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "That's good. That's a start." The young woman dropped to her knees beside the baby, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Ellie wasted no time. She moved through the small house with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the racing of her heart. The young woman, Rose, she had introduced herself as, sat trembling by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself as her teeth chattered violently. Caleb knelt beside the baby, his large hands hovering over her protectively, as if he could shield her from death itself through sheer will alone. "What's her name?" Ellie asked softly as she filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove. "Grace," Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. "Her name is Grace. She's only 2 months old." Ellie nodded, her throat tightening at the mention of the baby's age. She remembered holding her own grandson at that age, remembered the weight of him in her arms, the softness of his skin, the trust in his eyes. She pushed the memory aside and focused on the task at hand. "Rose, come closer to the fire," Ellie instructed gently. "You need to warm up before you can help your daughter. Caleb, take off that wet coat and hang it by the door. You won't do anyone any good if you catch your death." Caleb hesitated, his eyes never leaving the baby, but Rose reached out and touched his arm. "Do what she says," she murmured. "Please." He stood slowly, his movements stiff from the cold, and pulled off his heavy coat. Beneath it, he wore a simple shirt and vest, both damp with sweat and melted snow. Ellie noticed the revolver strapped to his hip, the worn leather of the holster, and for a brief moment, doubt flickered in her chest. But then she saw the way he looked at his wife and child, with a tenderness that no hardened outlaw could fake, and the doubt disappeared. Ellie returned to the fire with a clean cloth and a bowl of warm water. She knelt beside baby Grace, whose cries had softened to weak whimpers. The child's lips were still tinged with blue, her tiny fingers curled into fists. "I'm going to warm her up slowly," Ellie said, dipping the cloth into the water and gently pressing it against the baby's forehead. "Too much heat too fast can be dangerous. We'll take it slow and steady." Rose nodded, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "We were on our way back from Laramie," she said quietly. "Caleb got work there for a few weeks, fixing fences and breaking horses. We thought we'd make it home before the storm hit, but it came so fast. We tried to find shelter, but every door we knocked on—" Her voice trailed off, and Caleb's jaw tightened. "They saw me and decided we weren't worth the risk," he said bitterly. "Figured a man like me couldn't be trusted." Ellie glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "And what kind of man are you, Caleb?" He met her gaze steadily. "The kind who works hard to feed his family. The kind who'd rather die than see harm come to his wife and daughter. I'm not a saint, ma'am, but I'm no devil either." Ellie studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "That's all I needed to hear." She continued her careful work, warming the baby's limbs one at a time, rubbing gently to encourage circulation. Rose moved closer, her hands reaching out to touch her daughter's tiny feet, and Ellie guided her through the motions, showing her how to help without causing harm. After what felt like an eternity, baby Grace's color began to improve. Her whimpers turned into soft coos, and her eyes fluttered open, dark and curious. Rose let out a sob of relief and leaned down to kiss her daughter's forehead. "She's going to be all right," Ellie said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "She's a fighter, this one." Caleb sank into a chair, his head dropping into his hands. His shoulders shook, and for a moment, Ellie thought he might be crying. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough. "You saved her life. You saved all of us." Ellie waved a hand dismissively. "You don't need to thank me. I did what anyone with a heart would do." "But you're not just anyone," Rose said quietly. "You opened your door when no one else would." The storm had blown itself out by dawn, leaving Red Creek buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The sun rose pale and cold, casting long blue shadows across the drifts that had swallowed fences and transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and unforgiving. Ellie woke to the sound of movement in the main room. She had given Rose and Caleb her bed while she dozed fitfully in the rocking chair by the fire. When she emerged from her room, she found them preparing to leave, baby Grace bundled snugly in Rose's arms, her cheeks now rosy with health. Caleb stood by the door, his coat brushed free of snow, his hat in his hands. When he saw Ellie, he straightened, his expression solemn. "Mrs. Thornton," he began, "we can never repay what you've done for us. But I want you to know, the Mustang Valley Riders don't forget kindness like this. We'll be back to settle our debt properly." Ellie shook her head gently. "There's no debt, Caleb. You owe me nothing." Rose stepped forward, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small beaded bracelet, the kind made from leather cord and polished stones. "I made this for Grace," she said softly, "but I want you to have it. So you remember that you saved more than just a baby last night. You saved a whole family." Ellie accepted the bracelet with trembling fingers and slipped it over her wrist. She watched as they made their way down the snow-covered path, their figures growing smaller against the endless white until they disappeared entirely. 7 days passed. Ellie had returned to her quiet routine, feeding the fire, tending to the few chickens that had survived the storm, making simple meals for one. She thought often of Caleb, Rose, and baby Grace, wondering if they had made it home safely, hoping the child continued to thrive. Then, on the 8th day, she heard them coming. It wasn't the roar of motorcycles, but something older, more primal, the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them, echoing across the frozen prairie. Ellie stepped onto her porch and shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun. A line of riders crested the hill, moving in formation like a cavalry unit. At their head rode Caleb, his broad shoulders unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him came at least 20 others, men and women both, all dressed in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, their horses' breath rising in great plumes of steam. As they drew closer, Ellie saw that each rider led a pack horse, and each pack horse was laden with supplies: sacks of flour and grain, crates of preserved vegetables, smoked meat wrapped in canvas, bundles of firewood, jars of honey and preserves. The procession looked like something out of a story, impossible and overwhelming. Caleb dismounted first, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached the porch. Rose followed. Baby Grace, strapped securely to her chest in a blanket carrier, the child's bright eyes taking in everything with innocent wonder. "Mrs. Thornton," Caleb said, removing his hat, "I told you we'd be back." Ellie stood frozen, her hand gripping the porch railing. "Caleb, what is all this?" A woman dismounted behind him, tall and lean with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mrs. Thornton, my name is Sarah McKenna. I'm the head of the Mustang Valley Riders. Caleb and Rose are family to us, all of us. When we heard what you did for them that night, when everyone else turned them away, we knew we had to do something." Another rider, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, began unloading sacks from his pack horse. "We're ranchers, farmers, and wranglers, ma'am," he called out. "We take care of our own, and we take care of those who take care of us." Rose stepped closer, her eyes glistening. "We told them how you opened your door without hesitation, how you saved Grace's life. They wanted to make sure you'd never have to worry about surviving another winter alone." Ellie's vision blurred with tears. "This is too much. I can't possibly—" "You can and you will," Sarah said firmly but kindly. "This isn't charity, Mrs. Thornton. This is respect. This is gratitude. And this is what community looks like when it works the way it should." The riders worked with quiet efficiency, unloading supplies and stacking them carefully in Ellie's barn and root cellar. Sacks of flour and cornmeal, smoked hams wrapped in cloth, jars of pickled vegetables that gleamed like jewels in the afternoon light, dried beans, salt, sugar, coffee, enough to feed a family through the harshest winter, let alone one woman living alone. But it wasn't just food. They brought firewood, neatly split and stacked. They brought blankets, thick and warm. One rider even produced a new cast-iron skillet to replace the one Ellie had been using for 20 years, its bottom worn thin and uneven. As the sun began to sink lower, casting long orange shadows across the snow, Sarah McKenna approached Ellie with a leather pouch. She pressed it into the older woman's hands with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "This is from all of us," Sarah said quietly. "We each contributed what we could. Use it however you see fit." Ellie opened the pouch and felt her breath catch. Inside were coins and bills, more money than she had seen since William's death. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Sarah, then at the assembled riders who had stopped their work to watch. "I don't know what to say," Ellie whispered. "Don't say anything," Caleb replied, walking over with baby Grace in his arms. "Just promise you'll use it for something good." After the riders had departed, their hoofbeats fading into the distance, Ellie sat alone in her suddenly abundant home. She looked at the supplies, at the money, at the bracelet still on her wrist, and she thought about what Caleb had said. Use it for something good. 3 days later, Ellie hitched up her wagon and made the journey into Red Creek. She stopped first at Hope House, the orphanage run by Sister Catherine on the eastern edge of town. The building was old and drafty, always struggling to keep enough coal for heating and enough food for the children who had nowhere else to go. Sister Catherine answered the door, her weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "Eleanor, what brings you to town?" Ellie gestured to her wagon, loaded with supplies. "I've had some good fortune recently, sister, and I thought the children might benefit from warm blankets and full bellies this winter." The nun's eyes widened as she saw the contents of the wagon: blankets, preserves, sacks of flour, dried meat, and at the bottom an envelope containing half the money the riders had given her. "Eleanor, this is extraordinary," Sister Catherine breathed. "How did you—" "Someone showed me kindness," Ellie said simply. "I'm just passing it along." Word spread through Red Creek like wildfire. By the time Ellie returned home that evening, the town was buzzing with gossip. She could feel it in the way people had stared at her in the general store, in the whispered conversations that stopped when she drew near. Mrs. Thornton, living alone out on that ridge, suddenly had wealth to spare, and she'd gotten it from those people. The Mustang Valley riders, a rough bunch of cowboys and ranchers who kept to themselves and didn't attend church regularly. Decent folk didn't associate with their kind. The gossip reached the Miller household 2 days later, where Pearl Miller served tea to Constance Walsh in her precisely arranged parlor. "I heard she had 20 of them at her house," Pearl said, her voice dripping with scandalized delight. 20 riders just showing up unannounced. Who knows what really happened out there? "And now she's throwing money around like she's struck gold," Constance added, shaking her head. "Mark my words, Pearl, no good comes from associating with those types. Eleanor Thornton may have been a respectable woman once, but she's clearly lost her sense of propriety." The gossip eventually drifted beyond Red Creek, carried by travelers and traders who passed through town. It moved like smoke through the cold air, seeping into distant corners of the territory. And one evening, it found its way to a cramped, dimly lit room where Clayton Thornton sat, hunched over a half-empty bottle of whiskey. His wife Vera stood by the window, her sharp features illuminated by lamplight. "Your mother's been keeping secrets," Vera said, her voice cold and calculating. "Apparently she's come into quite a bit of money, and she's giving it away to orphans instead of helping her own family." Clayton stared at the amber liquid in his glass, his jaw working silently. The room smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed clothes, a far cry from the clean, orderly home his mother kept. He'd been living like this for months now, bouncing from one failed venture to another, always one step ahead of the debts that followed him like hungry wolves. "How much?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Vera turned from the window, her eyes glittering with cold satisfaction. "Enough to matter. Enough that she could have helped us when we needed it, but instead she's playing saint to a bunch of strangers and orphans who mean nothing to her. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. That ranch should be ours, Clayton. Everything in it should be ours. You're her only son, her flesh and blood, and she's giving away your inheritance to people who have no claim to it. Clayton drained his glass and poured another. The alcohol burned going down, but it didn't burn away the bitterness that had been growing in his chest for years. His mother had always been stubborn, always clinging to that ranch, to her memories of his father, to some fantasy of the life they'd had before everything fell apart. She never cared about what I needed, he muttered. Always about duty, about doing the right thing. But what about her own son? What about me? Vera placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but insistent. Exactly. It's time you took what's rightfully yours. 2 nights later, under a moonless sky, a wagon rolled slowly up the path to Copper Ridge. Clayton drove, his hands gripping the reins too tightly, while Vera sat beside him, her face set in hard determination. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire inside. Clayton knew his mother's habits. She'd be asleep by now, exhausted from another day of keeping up a ranch that was too much for one woman. They approached quietly, their boots crunching softly in the frozen snow. Clayton tried the door and found it unlocked. His mother had never been one to bar her door, even after his father's death. Too trusting, too naive. Inside, the house was warm and still. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. Clayton moved through the familiar space like a ghost, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. "Start with the barn," Vera whispered. "That's where she keeps the supplies. I'll look in here for the money." Clayton nodded and headed outside while Vera began her search. She moved through the main room with quick, practiced efficiency, opening drawers, checking shelves, her hands rifling through Ellie's belongings without care. She found the small wooden horse on the mantel first, the one William had carved. She picked it up, examined it briefly, then tossed it aside. It clattered across the floor and came to rest against the wall. Next, she found the tin-framed photograph of Ellie and William on their wedding day. She stared at it for a moment, her lip curling in disgust at the happiness captured there, then deliberately let it fall. The glass cracked with a sharp sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. In the bedroom, she found Ellie's small jewelry box. Not valuable pieces, just sentimental trinkets. Vera dumped the contents onto the bed, searching for anything worth taking. A simple gold band, William's wedding ring, a pair of earrings, a locket containing a faded photograph of baby Clayton. She pocketed the gold and left the rest scattered across the quilt. Clayton returned from the barn, his arms loaded with 2 sacks of flour. "There's enough out there to feed the whole county," he said, his words slightly slurred. "She's been holding out on us, Ma. All this time she could have helped, but she chose not to." He set the sacks down heavily, and as he turned, his boot caught the edge of the rocking chair, the one Ellie had sat in the night she saved Grace. It tipped backward and crashed against the wall, one of the spindles cracking with a sound like breaking bone. The crash of the rocking chair echoed through the house, and in the bedroom doorway a lamp flared to life. Ellie stood there in her nightgown, her silver braid hanging over one shoulder, the lamp trembling slightly in her hand. Her eyes moved from the overturned chair to the broken photograph on the floor, to the scattered contents of her jewelry box on the bed behind her, and finally to her son standing in the middle of her home like a thief in the night. "Clayton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what have you done?" He couldn't meet her eyes. Vera, however, showed no such hesitation. She stepped forward, her chin lifted defiantly. "We're taking what should have been ours all along," Vera said coldly. "You had money, Eleanor. You had resources, and you gave them away to strangers while your own son struggled. What kind of mother does that?" Ellie's gaze shifted to Vera, and for a moment, something hard and unyielding flashed in her eyes. The kind who raised a son to know right from wrong. The kind who taught him that family means more than money. She looked back at Clayton. "I gave you everything I had, Clayton. I sold my mother's china to send you to school. I worked my fingers to the bone on this ranch after your father died so you'd have something to inherit. And you thank me by breaking into my home?" Clayton's jaw tightened. "You had a chance to help us, Ma, but you chose them over your own blood." "I chose kindness over greed," Ellie said softly. She knelt slowly, her joints protesting, and picked up the broken photograph, cradling the pieces in her weathered hands. "This was your father and me on our wedding day. This was all I had left of him, and you destroyed it." For a brief moment, something flickered across Clayton's face. Shame, regret, the ghost of the boy he'd once been. But Vera's hand clamped down on his arm, and the moment passed. "We're not leaving empty-handed," Vera hissed. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the tension like a knife. At first it was distant, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then it grew louder, closer, until the thunder of horses surrounded the house completely. Ellie moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. The yard was filled with riders. Caleb sat atop his horse at the front, his face set in hard lines. Beside him was Sarah McKenna, and behind them, at least 24 members of the Mustang Valley Riders, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold night air. Several carried lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the snow. Caleb dismounted in one smooth motion and strode toward the house. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, his presence filling the small space with quiet authority. His eyes took in the scene immediately: the overturned chair, the broken glass, the scattered belongings, and Ellie standing with the torn photograph in her hands. His gaze moved to Clayton and Vera, and his expression turned to stone. "Step away from her," Caleb said, his voice low and deadly calm. Vera laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Or what?" "You'll do what exactly? This is family business, cowboy. It's got nothing to do with you." Sarah McKenna entered behind Caleb, her eyes sweeping the room with cold assessment. "Mrs. Thornton is family to us," she said quietly. "That makes this our business." Outside, the other riders had dismounted, forming a silent wall of solidarity. Through the open door, their silhouettes were visible, backlit by lantern light, an imposing sight that made Clayton take an involuntary step backward. "We heard the commotion from the ridge," Caleb continued, never taking his eyes off Clayton. "Funny thing about sound on a cold night. It carries. We heard the crash. We came to make sure Mrs. Thornton was safe." He paused. "Seems we got here just in time." Clayton's hand moved instinctively toward his coat, but Caleb's eyes narrowed in warning. "I wouldn't." From beyond the riders came another sound, the distinctive jingle of a badge and the measured clopping of an official's horse. Sheriff Tom Briggs rode through the assembled riders, his weathered face creased with concern. Sheriff Briggs dismounted slowly, his eyes moving from the assembled riders to the scene visible through the open doorway. He'd been riding back from a neighboring ranch when one of the Mustang Valley Riders had flagged him down, telling him there was trouble at the Thornton place. He stepped inside, his hand resting on his gun belt, not threateningly, but with the casual authority of a man who'd kept the peace for 30 years. His gaze took in the destruction: the broken chair, the shattered photograph frame, the scattered belongings, and the flour sacks that clearly didn't belong to Clayton. "Evening, Mrs. Thornton," he said quietly, tipping his hat to Ellie. Then his eyes moved to Clayton. "Son, you want to tell me what's going on here?" Clayton's face had gone pale, the bravado draining from him under the combined weight of the sheriff's stare and the silent riders filling the doorway. I was just breaking into his own mother's home," Caleb finished coldly, "destroying her property, stealing her supplies." "It's not stealing if it's family," Vera snapped. but her voice had lost its edge. Sheriff Briggs picked up the broken photograph frame, examining the torn image with a sad shake of his head. William Thornton was a good man. He'd be ashamed to see this. He looked at Clayton. You've got two choices, son. You can come with me peacefully and we'll sort this out at the jail, or we can do this the hard way. Either option, you're leaving Mrs. Thornton's property tonight. Clayton looked at his mother one last time, searching her face for something. Forgiveness, understanding, a lifeline. But Ellie simply stood there, the torn photograph clutched to her chest, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "I'm sorry, Ma," he said, his voice cracking. For a moment, he sounded like the boy he'd once been. Ellie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "So am I, Clayton. So am I." Sheriff Briggs led them both outside, Vera protesting loudly while Clayton walked in defeated silence. The riders parted to let them through, and within minutes, the wagon that had brought them disappeared into the darkness, followed by the sheriff's horse. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah McKenna was the first to speak. "Some of us will stay the night, Mrs. Thornton. Make sure there's no more trouble." Ellie shook her head gently. "That's not necessary." "It is," Caleb said firmly but kindly. He looked down at her, his expression softening. "Mrs. Thornton, the night you opened your door to us, you didn't just save Grace's life. You showed us that there's still good in this world, that there are people who see past appearances and judge others by their character." Rose stepped forward, baby Grace bundled in her arms. The child had grown so much in just a few weeks, her cheeks fuller, her eyes bright and alert. "You gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to turn," Rose said softly. "You asked for nothing in return. That's not something we take lightly." Sarah moved closer, her weathered hand resting gently on Ellie's shoulder. "We're not connected by blood, Mrs. Thornton, but we're connected by something stronger, by the kind of loyalty that's earned, not inherited. You're one of us now, whether you asked for it or not." Caleb knelt down, picking up the pieces of the broken photograph with careful hands. "I can't give you back your son," he said quietly. "I can't undo what he did tonight. But if you'll have me—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd be honored if you'd let me call you Ma." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Ellie's hand trembled as she reached out to touch Caleb's face, her weathered fingers gentle against his rough cheek. Tears finally spilled down her face, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were something else entirely. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, "you already have." Rose moved closer, placing baby Grace into Ellie's arms. The child cooed softly, her tiny hand reaching up to grasp Ellie's braid. "And Grace needs a grandmother," Rose said, her own eyes shining with tears. "A real one, someone who will love her not because they have to, but because they choose to." Ellie looked down at the baby in her arms, at the bright eyes staring up at her with complete trust, and felt something break open in her chest, not with pain, but with a fierce, overwhelming joy she thought she'd never feel again. "My granddaughter," she whispered, kissing the baby's forehead. Grace giggled, her tiny fingers wrapping around Ellie's thumb with surprising strength. Sarah stepped back, giving them space, and gestured to the other riders still standing in the doorway. "Let's give them some privacy," she said quietly. "We'll be right outside if you need us, Mrs. Thornton." As the riders filed out, Caleb stayed behind, helping Ellie into her rocking chair, the one that had been broken but was now being carefully set upright by his strong hands. He examined the cracked spindle with a critical eye. "I'll fix this properly tomorrow," he said. "Make it stronger than it was before." Rose settled onto the floor beside the chair, leaning her head against Ellie's knee while Grace remained cradled in the older woman's arms. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the room, and for the first time in 5 long years, the house didn't feel empty. "Tell me about him," Caleb said softly, nodding toward the pieces of the photograph still scattered on the floor. "Tell me about my grandfather." And so Ellie did. She told them about William, about his laugh that could fill a room, about the way he'd carved that little wooden horse with such patience and love, about the ranch they'd built together from nothing but determination and dreams. She told them about the grandson she'd lost, about the hole his death had left in her heart. "I thought that hole would never be filled," she said quietly, looking down at Grace. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my days alone, just waiting for my time to come." "You're not alone anymore, Ma," Caleb said, and the word, Ma, sounded so natural, so right, that it brought fresh tears to Ellie's eyes. Outside, the Mustang Valley riders had built a small fire in the yard, their silhouettes moving against the flames like guardians standing watch. Inside, a new family had been born, not through blood, but through something far more powerful. As the night deepened and baby Grace finally drifted off to sleep in Ellie's arms, Rose looked up at the older woman with a soft smile. "Do you think Clayton will ever come back?" she asked quietly. Ellie was silent for a long moment, her fingers gently stroking the baby's soft hair. "I don't know," she finally said, "but if he does, this door will still be open. Because that's what family does, real family. We keep the door open, even when it hurts, even when we've been betrayed. We hope for redemption, even when it seems impossible." Caleb nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "That's why you opened the door for us that night," he said. "Not just because Grace needed help, but because you still believed in second chances." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Ellie said softly. "Some people just take longer to find their way home." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, the little house on Copper Ridge felt like the center of the entire world, a place where kindness had been repaid, where strangers had become family, and where love had found a way to heal even the deepest wounds. Spring came to Red Creek with a gentleness that seemed to apologize for the harshness of winter. The snow melted slowly, revealing the green prairie grass beneath, and wildflowers began to dot the landscape with splashes of color. Ellie's ranch had transformed. The Mustang Valley riders had made good on their promise to help, and over the months, they'd repaired fences, reinforced the barn, and even added a small addition to the house, a room for when Caleb, Rose, and Grace came to visit, which was often. On Sunday afternoons, the ranch came alive with activity. Children from Hope House would arrive in wagons driven by Sister Catherine, and Ellie would teach them to feed the chickens, tend the garden, and ride the gentle mare that Sarah had gifted her. The sound of laughter once again filled the spaces between the fence posts. The people of Red Creek had slowly changed their tune. They saw the way the Mustang Valley riders cared for Ellie, the way they'd stand by her side without asking for anything in return. They saw the good work being done at Hope House, the children who now had warm clothes and full bellies. Judgment gave way to respect, and eventually to admiration. Clayton never returned. Ellie heard through the sheriff that he and Vera had left the territory entirely, heading east to start over somewhere new. The news had hurt, but it no longer consumed her. She had learned that you could love someone and still let them go, that sometimes the greatest act of love was simply keeping the door unlocked and the lamp lit in the window. On a warm evening in late May, Ellie sat on her porch in the old rocking chair, now repaired and sturdy, just as Caleb had promised. Grace, now nearly a year old, sat on her lap, babbling happily and pointing at the horses grazing in the distance. Caleb and Rose sat on the steps, their shoulders touching, watching the sun sink slowly toward the horizon. In the distance, the sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of more riders, Sarah and several others, coming for their weekly supper together. "Ma," Caleb said, turning to look at her with a smile, "you ready for the crowd?" Ellie looked at her grandson, for that's what he was now, in every way that mattered, and at the baby in her lap, at Rose with her gentle smile, and at the riders approaching in the distance. Her eyes moved to the bracelet still on her wrist. the one Rose had given her that first night, and she felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it took her breath away. "I'm ready," she said softly. "I've been ready my whole life for this." As the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the riders gathered around her table to share a meal and stories and laughter, Ellie understood something she hadn't before. Family wasn't just about blood, it was about showing up. It was about opening doors when others closed them. It was about choosing love over fear, kindness over judgment, and hope over despair. The winter had been harsh, but spring had come, and with it, a new beginning. Join us to share more meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story about the power of kindness and the true meaning of family. What did you think of Ellie's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.